and conversation with Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Honorable Member of Parliament and Chair Parliamentary Standing Committee on IT. It is indeed a pleasure to have Dr. Tharoor, to have you with us again. We have had many interactions on different topics with you, and it's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. Pleased to introduce our senior industry panel today, Mr. Uday Shankar, Senior Vice President FICCI, Dr. Jyotsna Suri, and Mr. Harshvardhan Yotia, past presidents of FICCI and co-chairs of FICCI Forum of Parliamentarians. I also extend a very warm welcome to the past presidents and members from industry and the media industry and from the cultural sector. May I now invite Dr. Jyotsna Suri, past president and co-chair of FICCI Forum of Parliamentarians and the chairperson and managing director of Dilip Suri Hospitality, to please welcome, deliver a welcome remarks. Dr. Suri.
Thank you, Dilip. Namaskar and a very warm welcome to today's interaction with Dr. Shashi Tharoor. A special welcome to all the participants who have logged in and are watching live on YouTube. Before I formally introduce the key speaker, let me just give you a little background about the Forum of Parliamentarians. So this forum was established by FICCI several years ago. It went into a hiatus, and it is during my tenure as FICCI president in 2015 that I resurrected it. It was then carried forward by Mr. Harsh Nyotia, who took over from me as FICCI president, and he's also the co-chair with me on this forum. Since then, we've had very successful interactions with UK, US, Germany, Japan, and are planning one with the UAE. Now, this platform has been in existence, like I told you earlier on. And just to mention that my late husband, Mr. Lalit Suri, was also a part of this, as a Rajya Sabha member, he was also a part of this forum. Well, the current situation being what it is, with the pandemic had completely changed our lives, we are now communicating with each other via internet. So we did some internal planning and thinking and said, how do we keep this forum alive? And so we decided that we will have a series of dialogues with parliamentarians and keep them engaged. So we did the first one with with Shri Bhupendra Yadavji, who's also the chair of this platform. And his topic was politics and governance in the post-COVID era. It was extremely successful. He gave us some very, very insightful thoughts. And then we thought that what role would culture play globally in this particular scenario, currently and post-COVID as well? We requested Dr. Tharoor to share his thoughts with us. And we're extremely grateful to you, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, for accepting our request so graciously. Interacting with him later on will be Mr. Uday Shankar, who is the Senior Vice President, FICCI, and President of Walt Disney Company for Asia Pacific, and Chairman of this Star and Disney India. Thank you, Uday. We appreciate your being with us. Now, Dr. Shashi Tharoor really needs no introduction, but I'll just, for the sake of record, share a few words about him. Dr. Tharoor is a multifaceted and a brilliantly gifted personality, no doubt about that. He's a famous author, politician, and a former international civil servant. He is an award-winning author of 20 fiction and non-fiction books, having won numerous awards for his accomplishments. He's a third-term Lok Sabha member of Parliament from, it's always difficult to pronounce that, but you know what I'm talking about, from Kerala. He has also served as a Minister of State for Human Resources and Development and Minister of State for External Affairs in the Government of India. He is currently chairs the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology. I now request Dr. Shashi Tharoor to share his views about the contours of cultural diplomacy in the current and in the post-COVID era. Shashi Tharoor, all yours.
Thank you very much, my good friend Jyotsna Suri, and to the very distinguished people who are listening in and who are addressing this. It's always a pleasure to address and interact with such an interesting group, and that too on the subject of soft power, a topic I've spent quite some time thinking and speaking about over the years. In fact, many have credited or blamed me with having brought the concept over into the Indian policy space more than a decade and a half ago. And I must say that it made sense to do it because for the longest time we were hearing a lot about our rising power in conventional terms, our consistent economic growth in the last couple of decades, which were leading people abroad to speak of India as the next superpower, future world leader, and all that stuff. And I must say, I've been troubled by that kind of talk. First of all, I think the notion of world leadership is a curiously archaic one. The very phrase is redolent of Kipling ballads and James Bondian adventures. I mean, what makes a country a world leader? I think in our case, it'll only be in population where we are on course to top the charts, overtaking China as the world's most populous country sometime before 2026. But this is where what's interesting about the whole idea of setting an example to the world is something altogether more difficult to define. It's a country's soft power. Many of you may be familiar with the concept, but in the interest of the uninitiated, let me just spell out what it means using the explanation of the very man who coined this term, the former Harvard professor, my good friend Joseph Nye, who came up with it in 1990 to describe the influence a country wields beyond its military or hard power. So it's more than cultural diplomacy, Jyoti, and that's why since you asked me to talk about soft power, I'm going to stick to that. See, traditionally, power in world politics was always seen in terms of military power. The side with the larger army was always likely to win. But even in the past, that wasn't enough. After all, the US lost the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union was defeated in Afghanistan, and the US discovered in its first few years in Iraq the wisdom of the famous adage by the French statesman Talleyrand that the one thing you cannot do with a bayonet is to sit on it. So that's where soft power comes in. If power represents your ability to alter the behavior of others to get what you want, then there are three ways you can do it. One is through coercion, sticks, muscle. The other is through inducements, payments, carrots. And the third is through attraction. And that is soft power, the power of attraction. And if you have that ability to attract through your cultural assets, which is one aspect of what you mentioned, your values, foreign policies, your overall nature as a society, then you can economize on the sticks and the carrots. And so soft power becomes both an alternative to hard power and a complement to it. If I can quote Nye specifically, quote, the soft power of a country rests primarily on three resources: its culture, in places where it's attractive to others, its political values, when it lives up to them at home and abroad, and its foreign policies, when they're seen as legitimate and having moral authority, unquote. And I'll come back to some of that later, but I'd go slightly beyond this. A country's soft power, to me, emerges from the world's perceptions of what that country is all about. The associations and attitudes conjured up in the global imagination by the mere mention of a country's name is often a more accurate gauge of its soft power than a dispassionate analysis of its foreign policies. Because hard power is exercised. You know, the danda, after all, has to be wielded. Soft power is evoked. It's what people feel. And so Nye, when he introduced the concept to the world, saw the US inevitably as the archetypal exponent of soft power, because the US is the home of everything, you know, Boeing and Intel, Google and the iPod or the iPad now, Microsoft and MTV, Hollywood and Disneyland, McDonald's and Starbucks. In short, of most of the major products that dominate daily life around our globe. I left out Coca-Cola and Levi's as well, right? So the attractiveness of these assets and of the American lifestyle of which they're emblematic was, in Nye's eyes, that they permit the US to persuade others to adopt the US's agenda rather than relying purely on the dissuasive or coercive hard power of military force. Now, I'm not sure I 100% buy this, because I think that you can wear Levi's or drink Coca-Cola and use Microsoft Windows and still not be predisposed towards Donald Trump's statements, or Guantanamo Bay prisoners, or extraordinary rendition, these wonderful American ideas. But anyway, if we take the idea global, beyond the US, Nye pointed out that in today's information era, three types of countries are likely to gain soft power and so succeed. Those whose dominant cultures and ideals are closer to prevailing global norms, which he defined as liberalism, pluralism, and autonomy. Those with the most access to multiple channels of communication, because that gives them more influence over how issues are framed. And those whose credibility is enhanced by their domestic and international performance. Now, many countries, obviously, to a greater or lesser extent, will fill the bill with these 3 points. So if you look around the world, soft power is a strategy pursued with success by many countries over the years. When France, for example, lost the War of 1870 to Prussia, Germany, one of its most important steps to rebuild the nation's shattered morale and enhance its prestige was to create the Alliance Française, to promote French language and literature throughout the world. And French culture then remained a major selling point for French diplomacy ever since. President Kennedy famously said, "Every man has two countries, his own and France." I mean, that was the absolute selling of French culture, right? The UK has a British Council similarly. The Swiss are pro-Helvetia. Germany, Spain, Italy, Portugal have institutes named for Goethe, Cervantes, Dante Alighieri, Camus. China has the Confucius Institutes, which in number will outstrip all of these. And India has our own more modest Council for Cultural Relations, or ICCR, that seeks to promote Indian culture internationally. The US itself has used officially sponsored initiatives, from the VOA to the Fulbright scholarships, to promote its soft power around the world. Now, my point is, and that's where I come back to you talking about cultural diplomacy in the introduction, soft power is not merely something that relies on governmental action, because then you're really relying on governments to sell your culture. Whereas arguably for the US, for example, Hollywood and MTV have done far more to promote the idea of America as a desirable and admirable society than the Voice of America or the Fulbright scholarships. And that's part of the important aspect of the soft power is created partly by governments, yes, but partly despite governments, partly by deliberate action and partly by accident. The world of the 21st century is increasingly a world in which the use of hard power carries with it the odium of mass global public disapproval, whereas the blossoming of soft power, which lends itself more easily to the information era, will constitute a much bigger asset. And you need hard power. I'm not denying that. Soft power without hard power is an admission of weakness. But hard power without soft power is bullying, and even more unpopular. So the important point here is that soft power is not about conquering others, which is what hard power is all about, but about being yourself and appealing to them. And so countries are being judged more and more by the soft power elements they project onto the global consciousness, either deliberately through the export of their cultural products, the cultivation of their foreign publics, and so on, or unwittingly through the ways in which they are perceived as a result of news stories about them in the global mass media, and the way in which people understand what a culture is all about. So I would even go far enough to say that soft power is most useful when it isn't deliberately enforced or marketed. Rather, when it genuinely represents the culture of its own country and that appeals to people of other countries. So these assets may not directly persuade others to support India, but they go a long way towards enhancing India's intangible standing in the world's eyes. And that's why I'm talking about soft power in this context as one of actually promoting the aspects and products of our society and culture that the world would find attractive. Now, the obvious example is cuisine. Indian restaurants have proliferated around the world in ways that simply weren't true when I first went abroad as a graduate student, for example. I remember testifying before the German Constitutional Court for the UN in my UN days in the tiny town of Karlsruhe. And the Germans were so happy with me, they wanted to treat me to an Indian meal. And there actually was one Indian restaurant in town. Today, of course, there's probably more than one in every German city. I remember going to a sort of one-horse town in the Australian wine country in upstate Victoria, and the only restaurant in the entire town was an Indian one. So you're looking at the way in which our cuisine has acquired universal credibility. And Robin Cook, a former foreign secretary in the UK, famously declared when asked what was a British national dish, he didn't say fish and chips, he said chicken tikka masala. And it's striking that UK curry houses, as they call them, these Indian restaurants in the UK, today employ more people than the shipbuilding, coal mining, and steel making industries combined. So the empire can strike back. But for this group, I think we can go beyond cuisine to talk about cinema, because I can again tell you from my international experience of innumerable conversations with African ministers and diplomats who would speak fondly of the expectations of looking forward as young children to the next Bollywood film coming to their village. One Senegalese diplomat told me how his illiterate mother would make a monthly bus trip to the capital city, Dakar, from their village every month just to catch the latest Bollywood film. Now, the films are made in Hindi, obviously, so she couldn't understand that. She was illiterate, so she couldn't read the subtitles in French. But as you know, our movies are made to be enjoyed without these handicaps, despite these handicaps. And as a result, she left with stars in her eyes about India. And that's precisely where the soft power cinema came in. I remember an Indian diplomat friend in Damascus in the late 90s telling me the only portraits in Damascus that were allowed to be shown that were as large as those of the prevailing president and dictator Hafiz al-Assad were portraits of Amitabh Bachchan. And that's also soft power. So that's about Bollywood. But in fact, as we know, our visual entertainment goes well beyond Bollywood. And so you can take a very different example of how soft power actually helped us in national security terms, and that is Afghanistan, where we didn't actually ever have a significant military mission there, even though Afghanistan is very important to our national security. But our biggest asset for a very long time came from one simple fact. Till a couple of years ago, well, more than a couple now, it's still about 5-6 years ago, you simply couldn't try to telephone an Afghan at 8:30 in the evening. Why? Because that was when the Indian television soap opera, Kyunki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi, was telecast on Tolo TV, dubbed into Dari, and no one wished to miss it. It was reportedly the most popular television show in Afghan history, at least until the onset of Afghan Idol or whatever. It was considered directly responsible for a spike in the sale of generator sets, and even blamed for absences from religious functions, which clashed with its broadcast times. In fact, this created a lot of opposition to the show from some of the mullahs who successfully, in the end, managed to shut it down. But while it was on, SARS so thoroughly captured the public imagination in Afghanistan that in this deeply conservative Islamic country, where family problems are usually hidden behind the veil, quite literally, it's an Indian TV show to dominate society's discussion of family issues. I actually read reports, and I'm not quoting Indian journalists or Indian press. This was actually a Reuters story that I saw of wedding banquets being interrupted so that the guests could huddle around the television for half an hour. Even of an increase in crime at 8:30 p.m. because watchmen were sneaking a look at the TV rather than minding the store. There was one episode I read about how robbers in the town of Mazar-e-Sharif stripped a vehicle of its wheels, its mirrors, its hubcap, its windshield wipers, every detachable part during the telecast time. And they wrote on the car in an allusion to the show's heroine, Tulsi Zindabad. That's soft power. And India doesn't have to thank the government or charge the taxpayer for its exercise. In fact, we too can simply say Tulsi Zindabad. I only wish that Tulsi had stayed in the industry and not gone over into politics, but that's another story. Now, the point is that this is soft power we don't have to thank the government for. So while Jyoti is right that cultural diplomacy has some value and is important, I think cultural diplomacy focuses on what governments can do to showcase our culture, promote Indian society, film festivals, that sort of stuff. But actually, most people can see through propaganda for what it is. And the truth is that the message that really matters and the one that gets through to foreigners is that of who we are, not what we want to show. So what's striking is that India has been benefiting from the future and the past. So we have the international appeal of our traditional practices, from Ayurveda to yoga. I mean, yoga, the International Day of Yoga was a genuine coup for the government because it's meant that every year, one day, people are performing yoga and recalling India in many ways, thanks to the UN adopting that. The transformed image of our country created by a thriving diaspora is also part of what India is perceived as being. Our culture certainly is not exclusively Indian. There are versions of the Ramayana being performed right across South Asia. As far as the Philippines, in fact, Indonesia everyone knows about, but the Philippines even did a Western style dance ballet based on the Ramayana. And each of these cultures thinks of the Ramayana as their own. Information technology, this is where the future comes in, is also part of our soft power, because what's happened is that now we've gone from being associated with beggars and snake charmers and fakirs lying on beds of nails. We're now associated with every Indian perceived to be a computer geek or a software wizard, right? So the result is that I was accosted, I remember some years ago, by a sweating European at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam saying to me, you're Indian, can you fix my laptop? I mean, the assumption is that's how you are. Unfortunately, I majored in history and I couldn't. But the point is precisely that's now the expectation. That's what people think of when they think of Indians. It was very striking, when I was still in the States now more than a decade ago. At the beginning, I guess, of the first decade of the century, the Americans had a television show called ER standing for Emergency Room. And it was a huge hit for many years, the #1 show. But when it first came out, when they showed a pilot, it got panned by the critics who wrote, how can you have a show about an emergency room that doesn't actually show an Indian doctor? Because no emergency room in America doesn't have an Indian doctor. And so the result was that, in fact, they had to go back, cast an Indian, namely Parminder Nagra of Bend It Like Beckham, in a key part as an Indian doctor. And that's how ER became a successful hit, because the credibility required an Indian doctor. Now, those are the kinds of things that ultimately we're talking about here, because India's image, I mean, it's not just India. China and Russia will benefit more from kung fu movies or the Bolshoi ballet than the People's Liberation Army bashing up people in Galwan or the Siberian oil reserves. Because ultimately the state may rely on the latter, but the former is the kind of society that others want to see, enjoy, and want to share. Joseph Nye often says it's the side with the better story that wins in the information age. India must remain the land of the better story. As a society with a free press and a thriving mass media, with a people whose creative energies are daily encouraged to express themselves in a variety of appealing ways, India has an extraordinary ability to tell stories that are more persuasive and attractive than those of its rivals. And that's the strength. And it's not just what we can deliberately and consciously exhibit or put on display or promote through our diplomacy. It's what others see, who we are, whether we are or are not trying to show it to the world. I mean, I can tell you, for example, before I came back to India and Indian politics, in 2004, I was traveling in the Gulf countries for the UN. And I can't tell you the astonishment of my Arab interlocutors, ministers, senior civil servants, with the Indian election results that had just taken place the same week that I was traveling, because there we had, and they said to this to me with astonishment, an election being won by a party led by a woman of Roman Catholic background and Italian origin, making way for a Sikh to be sworn in as prime minister by a Muslim in a country, the Muslim president, in a country 81% Hindu. And that sort of thing really won the world's admiration and imagination. I said, listen, this is This is India. This is the way we are. No one's trying to do this to impress you. And that's the sort of thing, when Mahatma Gandhi, after all, won independence through the use of soft power too, because nonviolence and satyagraha were also classic uses of soft power before the term was even coined. So all of these qualities are extremely important. The diversity in our society. I've been fond of quoting the British historian E.P. Thompson, who said that India is perhaps the most important country for the future of the world. All the convergent influences of the world, he said, run through this society. There is not a thought that is being thought in the West or the East that is not active in some Indian mind. And that really is what holds up. I know that some people in India, and you know who they are, have been very worried that our opening up to the world will bring with it cultural imperialism of a particularly insidious kind, that Game of Thrones and burgers will supplant Garba dances and Bhelpuri. I mean, the fact is that I think we have demonstrated conclusively in the last 30 years that we can drink Coca-Cola without becoming Coca-Colonized. We will not become any less Indian if, in Mahatma Gandhi's famous metaphor, we open the doors and windows of our country and let foreign winds blow through our house, because we're strong enough not to be blown off our feet by these winds. Our popular culture has been resilient enough to compete successfully with MTV and McDonald's. And our strength has lain in our ability to absorb all sorts of influences and to transform them by a sort of peculiarly Indian alchemy into something that belongs naturally on the soil of India. So Bollywood, Bhangra, all that have made us a player in globalization, not merely a subject of it. I want to try and wrap up, because I know we're going to go into an interesting exchange with the audience, and particularly with Uday Shankar. But I'll end by just one caveat. We shouldn't overstate soft power either. You can't pretend that soft power will solve all our foreign policy or security challenges. After all, an Islamist terrorist who enjoys a Bollywood movie will still have no compunction about setting off a bomb in a Delhi market. And the US has already learned that the perpetrators of 9/11 ate their last dinner at a McDonald's. So the truth is that we need both soft power and hard power. Hillary Clinton once spoke of smart power, and that's a very good way of looking at it. But I do want to stress the importance of preserving these qualities in India that make us so appealing to the world. The precious pluralism that is a civilizational asset for India in our globalizing world, and which is sadly under threat in our country today. Our democracy and dissent, our thriving free media, our contentious civil society forums, our energetic human rights groups, our free elections and our fractious political parties, all of this show India in a very positive light in the eyes of the world. So the kinds of things that the government likes to delegitimize, saying dissent is bad, you're anti-national and so on, actually these are the things that strengthen our image abroad. When Indians are defending the human rights of other Indians, when we are saying our minorities have the same rights a majority does, when we promote environmentalism, we fight injustice, we criticize the authorities, we challenge, receive wisdom, all of these actually help enhance India's stature. And it's essential that India does not allow the specter of religious intolerance and majoritarian politics to undermine our soft power, which remains our greatest asset in the world of the 21st century. If we succeed in maintaining our heritage as a diverse and democratic country, open to the contention of ideas and interests within it, unafraid of the prowess or the products of the outside world, and wedded to the democratic pluralism that is our greatest strength, I think we'll liberate and fulfill the creative energies of our people, and we will be an India that will tell the stories the world wants to hear and is glad to repeat. That could well be the most valuable way in which we can truly offer world leadership in the 21st century world. Thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
So I think now I'll just hand over to Mr. Uday Shankar to conduct the conversation. Please, Uday, over to you.
Thank you, Dilip. And Dr. Tharoor, thank you very much for that really, really eloquent articulation of the case for soft power. And I think you by far are one of the most elegant and articulate spokesperson for all the elements that constitute soft power. And it's heartening, it's refreshing, to be honest, to hear a politician talk about this.
Thank you.
Because this is something that we, who are practitioners of soft power in our own little domain, we keep talking about it. We've used forums like FICCI Media and Entertainment Forum and various other industry forums to make this issue. But rarely does it get discussed in serious policy or governance forums where official participation decides the day. So it's really heartening to hear what you say. And you talked about liberalism, pluralism, autonomy. You talked about culture, political values, foreign policy that go into constituting soft power. And I couldn't agree more with you as a former journalist and news editor, and as a person who has spent 31 years in media and creativity. This just sounds like music to me. The question is that despite such a compelling case for all this, why is it, and I should qualify in the beginning, that whatever I'm going to say is strictly bipartisan? Because unfortunately, when it comes to soft power, there seems to be an overarching consensus in this country that the elements of soft powers must be kept strictly in chains. And that is the problem. You talked about Hollywood, you talked about Alliance Francaise, you talked about the British Council, you talked about, and there are other elements, the newer ones, post-colonial and modern institutions that have come up, like the CNN and the Hollywood. You talked about, my own company's assets like the Disneyland, etc. And those are all really, really compelling elements. And if today American culture is recognized, it's recognized less for its military forces and more probably in the masses by this. And yet the one thing that we seem to have done is to make sure that in India we do not even give our own soft power, our own stories, and our own ability to spread our culture beyond our shores and get people to see who we are, what we are for. And the tragedy is that every government, national, state, and now the malaise seems to have run so deep that even municipal and local authorities, the first thing they want to do, from a lowly government official in a small part of the country to the senior most functionaries, the one thing that they all want to do is to contain the creativity of this country. Why is that the case? Why despite such a strong case, why there is a complete consensus, so to speak, on not letting it have a chance?
I don't know if there's a complete consensus, because certainly I think a lot of people in my party are very much inclined to think the way I do. And in fact, I was in talks with Kamal Nath just before his government fell about a new film policy that the Madhya Pradesh government could offer, in which they could actually open up the space to people like you, television and film producers, with very attractive incentives and concessions to film in their state, because your presence would bring in business and, of course, help restaurants, help local labor, help all sorts of people. And Kamal was very, very persuaded by this and was terribly open. In fact, I think he had instructed his office to pursue this idea. I had received some ideas from Bollywood producers who had shared them with him. Unfortunately, his government fell and he couldn't take it forward. But there are people who definitely see the advantages of all this. I was shocked when a prominent Bollywood director told me that it was actually easier and cheaper for him to film abroad in some European countries than to film in India. He invited me to see one of his films, and I asked, "This is wonderful, but why did you have to go abroad for the story? The story could easily have been filmed in India." And he said, "Because it's actually easier to film abroad." And that was the answer. And I accept your criticism that the constraints are enormous, that particularly we have a narrow-minded bureaucratic mentality that has governments wanting to tax, wants governments to license, governments wanting to restrict. And that, I'm afraid, is a mindset problem. I mean, I have the advantage, I suppose, of not having spent my adult life in this mindset. I was abroad and living internationally from my late teens right up to my return into Indian politics 11 years ago. And in these 11 years, I've consistently been a voice for a much more open-minded approach to all of these things. So let me assure you that not everyone shares the mindset that you're concerned about. I think that this kind of top-down license permit quota mentality, tax them, tax them really almost to the point of extinction. That mentality is not necessarily as widespread as you seem to fear. And I also think that the next generation is going to rise above that because they've grown up with a lot of media and they recognize what an important part media and creativity are playing in their lives. As you know, the recently banned TikTok had made everyone a creator, and people have begun to realize how useful it is. In fact, during lockdown, some of the most unlikely people were recording songs and videos and all sorts of things to put their talents on display. And I think they will understand the value of liberating creativity rather than hemming it in.
Look, I don't certainly mean that everyone is aligned. You certainly are, as we have seen and we've heard you over the years. And I'm sure there are a lot of other people across the political spectrum. But by and large, and I'm not even talking about the physical constraints or the financial constraints that one faces. You're absolutely right, the producer or director who told you that it's easier to shoot abroad. It's also considerably cheaper to shoot in New Zealand, in many other parts of the world, in Canada, etc., etc. But that's just one side of it. The real side is creativity, whether it is a creativity in filmmaking or whether it is creativity in developing a new product, is all about pushing the boundaries. And the real issue is that even the states that want you to come and shoot a film and give you incentives and welcome you with open arms, when you release a film in that state, the theaters are vandalized and there is a police case, and there are, I'm sure you know about movies after movies that haven't been released for months, if not years, just because somebody, just anyone out of a population of 130 billion people did not like and got offended. And the right to get offended certainly takes precedence here over the right to push creativity. And that's the problem.
Well, this is a genuine problem, and I have to admit it's a political problem because our politicians have indulged every little interest group that claims they're offended by something. I think many of you remember how Shah Rukh Khan had to change the title of Billu Baba because the barbers, hairdressers said that Baba was an offensive term. It got to something as ridiculous as that. And of course, the Padmavati episode everyone knows about. There have been so many such examples. It affects books as well, by the way, not just films. Yes. But sure, I mean, I understand what you're saying. And the only silver lining on this is that the courts, especially when you get to the higher courts, have actually been a very, very good source of resistance to this idea. If you look at Justice Kaul's judgment on the Hussain case, where he talked precisely about art being judged on a different plane and that people don't have a right to censor other people's creativity in the name of being offended. And he's now on the Supreme Court. There are people like that who have stood up, I think, for a significant change of attitude on all of this. And where the politicians, in their anxiety to pander to sectional interests, because every interest group represents a vote or a potential vote bank, where politicians have been insufficiently supportive, I would urge you to go to the high courts and, if necessary, the Supreme Court. I'm sorry to even have to suggest that as a politician. I would rather we were more liberal and understanding. But since your experience and what you're asking is reflective of a certain attitude, I think that we may have no choice but to encourage you to seek refuge behind the freedoms that the judiciary is willing to enshrine. And by and large, judicial judgments have been very much on the liberal side when it comes to freedom of expression, censorship, banning of films, and so on. And as far as the new television and OTT media are concerned, my position has consistently been in favor of self-regulation. I do not want to get you guys having to show your stuff to the censor board. I think that's going to be calamitous. So this Indian habit of being too easily offended really must be fought.
Thank you for saying that. And you are a critical stakeholder in as the chairman of the standing committee of for IT. You're a critical stakeholder, and I think the position that you take or your philosophy and belief would certainly weigh in on the policy that we eventually see. We hope so, but
I'll do my best.
That is exactly the problem, Dr. Tharoor, if I may just pursue with that point again. That even as a new initiative comes in, it's still early days for streaming. It's just a few years old in this country. We've got the bandwidth, etc., only recently to be able to do that. A fledgling industry needs all support. The IT industry today is such a big economic force and such a big brand force for India, primarily because it was not fettered in its early days. There weren't multiple compliances and there weren't multiple regulatory bodies that were created to sort of for them to navigate just as they set up a company. Today, streaming is so easy that a 12-year-old kid can create an app and start streaming, and we could be really a global powerhouse with our cultural richness and diversity and everything that you talked about, our technological capability, and the fact that for the first time a country like India has a chance because it doesn't, technology has allowed us to disintermediate all the global intermediaries. We don't need to go through gateways. We can just deliver it in every home. And yet our own intermediaries, so to speak, that we have created are creating increasing fetters, as if, our culture, our society, our morality is so fragile that if we said one wrong word, it would crack like a glass mirror. How does one deal with that? And I'm asking that question both in your personal belief, but also because you preside over a very important institution.
Well, no, let me speak personally because I don't have a mandate from the committee to speak on their collective behalf. Obviously, anything I say to you, I'm prepared to advocate within the committee as well and to push it as chairman. I will say that, first of all, some risk-taking is unavoidable. I mean, your own company, your Disney company, has expanded exponentially in recent years. You've shown a certain vision and have articulated a willingness to impact society in a positive way. For example, in the West, in America, it's been a significant Disney policy to promote actors and actresses of color, create the Black Panther as a black superhero in a world in a world previously dominated by white superheroes, right? So you are saying you're willing to push the envelope in that society. Now you can turn around and say, well, America is different. They're willing to have the envelope pushed. India may not be so willing. But my answer to you is try us. If everyone is going to take the most cautious approach and say, oh, I'm scared of doing this because India won't take it, then India will never take it. Whereas the way in which India has changed, and I've seen this because I left India as a graduate student in '75, came back on annual holiday, sure, but really returned for good only in 2009 and late 2008. You can imagine the transformations that I have seen that perhaps all of you didn't notice because you were living here. And the transformations I've seen suggest that India has accepted a lot of things it was not prepared to accept earlier, whether on Dalit empowerment, on OBCs rising to positions of power, on issues of color. For example, this whole Fair and Lovely controversy would never have happened a few years ago. I'm sure that we will now be ready for something like promoting the Indian equivalent of a superhero from a deprived community, a marginalized community. I mean, there are things that can be done, and I would urge Disney to expand further into our hinterland, go more into vernacular entertainment, go into the media of our states, and get people to think new things. I think if we live in fear that we will be constantly blocked by those who are easily offended, I think that we are doing ourselves a disservice, and we are also failing to challenge India's capacity to adjust. Look at the way, for example, the extraordinary amount of homophobia in this society, and now the complete acceptance of the Supreme Court verdict on Section 377. I think there's no doubt that in many ways you folks can reach far more minds and help shape far more attitudes than these easily offended interest groups. So you should really make a partnership with progressive forces in India, progressive professionals in India, to actually grow your business by helping change and shape new attitudes. I don't know if that's coming across as a challenge, but you do have the power to push ideas. And I think that's true of others listening in. You can really help shape a new 21st century India through your platform.
I think a lot of people are listening. A large number of media professionals have logged in, and they would be listening to what you're saying. And I think there's a lot of merit in that. But unless we create an institutional, sort of politico-creative framework that allows this to happen, it will remain a sporadic individual initiative subject to individual challenges or encouragement. How does one do that? And because unless we do that, we will not be able to create an economic media and entertainment and such other industries that we talk about are not really just soft power. They're also hard economic power. Today, the media and entertainment, the creative industries in the US or even in many parts of Europe contribute to their economies a huge share. We are not able to do that primarily because we looked at media and content either as fun, glamour, entertainment, or sometimes as sin. How do we change the perception and look at it as an creative economy? How does one do that?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, your own attitude is the right one, that you are part of the creative economy, and what you're doing is something that contributes to India's economic growth as well as its image around the world. You need, of course, people who see it that way. I'm proud to say that just before the last elections, where I'm sorry that my party performed so disastrously, I was able to lead a number of consultations, including one organized by FICCI, with leaders in the cultural space, not just media, but also dance, theater, music, and so on, asking them what they wanted from a potential Congress government. Yes, we're not in the government, but that kind of thinking is out there. And though only the conclusions have come out in our manifesto, the background paperwork and the ideas that was given to me by experts right across. I met people in Mumbai, I met people in Delhi, I met people in Chennai, Hyderabad, Bangalore. There were media people from all over who came up with very, very interesting, constructive suggestions. Of course, they were the media people who were willing to meet a congressman. That's another matter. In the current political atmosphere in our country, that may not be a totally representative group, but their ideas, I thought, were excellent. And they're out there, they're available. We haven't forgotten them. And I think the people who are in a position to make a difference in government come armed with such ideas, it should make a real difference. I'm very happy, by the way, to share all this with our present government. Unfortunately, they have not shown any inclination to give culture much priority, and their successive culture ministers have not been, sad to say, not been particularly significant figures in the cabinet. And therefore, it's been difficult to make any headway in terms of any new thinking in these places. I'm very willing to say that that new thinking is required. We can do some of it in the committee, and I am very receptive, especially once lockdown is over. But maybe if the speaker and the authorities are willing to permit virtual meetings, and even before that, receptive to having hearings with people like you to tell us what you want to see in government policy. Because, we can relate to the ministries, but the ministries, let's face it, are run by bureaucrats. And bureaucrats think bureaucratically. That's the name of the game.
Thank you. Thank you for your generous offer. And I'm sure we'll take you up on that. Sooner or later, the lockdowns will get lifted. And we should have more engagement with members of my community on that. But I appreciate that offer. Not to make too much of a point, you and I can go on because it's a subject that we both are passionate about. But I'm sure there are lots of my friends and colleagues who've logged in and who would want to ask you questions. So if it's okay, Dilip and Jyotsna ji, we can ask some people to take the question. I just wanted to say one thing, Dr. Tharoor, I hope it is not misunderstood. Personally, I have been in this industry as a media person for over 30 years. Personally, my experience has been that the governments, regardless whether they're at the national level or state level, as institutions and organizations, have at best been indifferent to the power of media, and that is the best that we could ask for. Usually, in power, they have been hostile to it, and that is where the problem is. Because there are, if you really look at the last 30 or 40 years history, or even post-liberalization, a lot of new policies, legislations have come in, but there is really nothing that stands out as a case for making media, entertainment, or the soft power either a thriving economic industry or unshackle it. So I think there is need for everyone to come together.
Well, I'm happy to hear your proposals on this, but I have to say, you're a bit younger than me, but I think you certainly do remember in India when there was only one television channel where both TV and radio were government monopolies, where there was no internet.
Yes.
And even a lot of the print newspapers looked like a series of rather dull press releases issued by ministries. So I think you have to admit there's been significant progress.
Of course.
And it's not indifference. I think some of that progress has come because people in power were proactively willing to let things happen, whether it was through deregulation or delayed regulation.
Or delayed regulation, yes.
The cable industry, the IT business, all of that. And I think we should keep pressing for more of it. I'm for example, very keen on pushing the government to release more spectrum for private
Yes.
use of citizens and commercial ventures, because we retain a ridiculously large percentage of our spectrum in the hands of the government and the military. And that's why we have amongst the weakest broadband signals in the world,
Absolutely.
and why we've limited ourselves as much as we have. I think we're 93rd in a list of 120 countries when it comes to the depth, speed, and range of our broadband. And I think that's something we really could easily fix, because you guys are willing to invest what it takes in the infrastructure if you're allowed to. And it's silly that the government and the bureaucracy has not allowed you to. So we can push things like that in the policy space. But I do think things have got better, and they can continue to get better, but we have to keep pushing.
On
The
that
door
note,
is
thank you
not
very much.
shut or locked. It's slightly ajar.
Thank you very much on that note. Jyotsna ji.
Yes, thank you there. Thank you, Shashi. That was really very engaging. And I'm going to now open it up. Dilip Chenoy, if you can take over the question answers, please.
Yeah, I have three hands raised, but in the beginning, if it's possible, I would actually like to. I saw on the on attending is His Excellency the Ambassador of Vietnam to India, and we are very delighted that you could actually join, because I think our paths crossed earlier when you were the Director General of Cultural Diplomacy and UNESCO Affairs Department and Secretary General of the Vietnam Commission for UNESCO. So thank you very much for being with us today. I don't know, Excellency, if you would like to make a comment or ask a question. If you do, you'll have to unmute yourself, Excellency. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitee. I think that this is a very interesting topic, particularly at this crucial moment when I believe that soft power should play its role. I just want to have one very precise question addressed to the former minister, that does India have a full-fledged cultural diplomacy at the central government? Because in Vietnam, we have defined our foreign policy, which is based on three pillars. The first pillar is political diplomacy, which date back during the Vietnam War. The second pillar, which we call economic diplomacy, when we started our renewal policy 5 years before the liberalization in India. And then after that, we launched what the third pillar we call culture diplomacy pillar. So all the three pillars made up the comprehensive foreign policy of Vietnam. And in addition to that three pillar, we have one another. We don't call it as a pillar, but we call an important task namely to take care of our diaspora overseas. And the diaspora also play an important role in the three pillars of foreign policy. So my questions to our foreign minister is that, does India have at any moment previously a full-fledged culture diplomacy? Thank
Yes,
you.
indeed. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Yes, indeed, we do. I don't know whether we've defined it as formally as you've done in terms of political diplomacy, economic diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, diaspora diplomacy, but all those elements, all four of those elements are very much a part of Indian foreign policy and outreach. In fact, for 5 years, I chaired the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. And during that time, we did a detailed study and report on cultural diplomacy, which is now a public document that I would strongly recommend to all of you listening. It is on our website, the Lok Sabha website, the Parliament website. And if you search for that report, you will be able to find both the enunciation of government policy as well as the views of some of us, particularly as chairman, I sign off on every sentence in the report on how exactly we can promote our cultural diplomacy better. I don't think we have done as well as we could have. A few festivals of India, a few Nehru centers in a few places around the world. Those are not enough. And using our skills in many ways, our talents, to leverage our cultural diplomacy is something we could do better. But if you would like to look at that report, I'm very proud of that report, but it's also a fairly monumental document, 50, 60 pages long, that spells out in some detail what kind of steps the government has taken, should do better, and can take, and that the committee recommended it take. It's a report that, as I say, is available on the Parliament website. But thank you for your question, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency, and thank you, Dr. Tharoor. I have a question on the chat box, which actually goes deeper into the question asked by the Excellency. I'll just read it out. This is from Shilpa Shaju. Says, I would like to ask a question, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. You mentioned how there ought to be a balance between hard and soft power, but India being a melting pot of diverse cultures, how exactly do we focus in cultural diplomacy? Also, do you think when something like art and cinema can offend most of us, will we be able to have a common ground on culture and then use it as a soft power?
Yeah, I mean, if it were left to me, I would focus heavily on our diversity, on showcasing our diversity. See, my point is that there should be no self-appointed guardians of Bharatiya Sanskriti telling us what is authentically Indian and what is not. Any cultural product of any Indian is authentic in as much as he or she is concerned, and therefore has every right to be out there. Of course, the marketplace will judge, public will judge, society will judge. But I think what's important is to showcase that diversity. I would even take it to the extent of dissenting opinions. I mean, I would, when I was minister, certainly the Nehru Center was welcome in London to have a speaker from the opposition side who would be. Yes, hello. Is there a problem? I'm hearing somebody else.
No, please go ahead, Dr. Tharoor.
So I'm just saying that showcasing our diversity is the way in which we would be able to answer this. In other words, I mean, the classic answer to all of this business of being offended is, if you're offended, change the channel. There's something else you can watch that may not offend you. If you're offended, don't watch the film. If you're offended, don't read the book. Don't deny others the rights to do something, because they may not be offended by it even if you are. That's the simple message to the offended. I don't know why it has been so difficult for governments to stand up consistently for that. Our courts have by and large done so. They have said that you know, the offended should not be the ones prevailing. Of course, there will be some respect for community standards. So you know that in our country, there are some sensitivities, and particularly religion is a major area of sensitivity. So anything that could offend a religious community usually creates huge problems. But short of that, almost anything else is or should be fair game. And let's face it, most producers of cultural products don't necessarily themselves want to do something that is so unacceptable it may bring them costs. And who wants their bookshop burned down? Who wants their studio set broken down, who wants their channel taken off the air, who wants, I mean, nobody really wants to see themselves suffering. So there will always be a certain common sense on the part of a producer, distributor, director as to how far they would go. And that's why I think some of this debate is actually unnecessary, because once you've gone through all those processes, and in the case of films for public distribution, even gone through the censor board, if somebody claims that they're offended, tell the police to put them in their place, because you have a right, having done all the right things, to go ahead and exhibit your film. And if they don't like it, they can stay away. I don't even object to their having a peaceful picket outside the movie theater. But threatening of violence should be unacceptable in a free society. And my mind is very clear on this. I'm sorry that that's not always been true of every government in every state.
Sorry, that was a call from Mr. Neotia in Calcutta that it's raining heavily there and he's been logged off. So, you know, and Devin, who was supposed to ask the next question, electricity has gone off for him. But I have a hand raised. Mr. Vinod Juneja, would you like to ask a question, or if you would?
I just want to check up to our Honorable Shashi Tharoor that what happened to this Bharatiya Vidya Bhavans having abroad, they were doing things, still they are active, Bharatiya Vidya Bhavans?
Yes, but they're not part of the government. I welcome any individual agency doing its own thing. And there's a very, very impressive Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan that I knew when I was in New York, for example. And I'm sure they have many others. I think there's one in Singapore, there's one in London. So, I mean, I think any institution, I mean, the Ramakrishna Mission is in various places. I mean, anyone who wants to take their ideas abroad is free to do so. But it won't be seen necessarily as representative, right? So say the International Society for Krishna Consciousness or the Transcendental Meditation Movement also have presences abroad, but they speak for themselves. They can't presume to speak for all of India. And the same applies in that sense to the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, even if they have a more national sort of perspective, and I have a lot of respect for them. I will say that, that it's different from an official agent of cultural diplomacy like a Nehru Center. But that's fine, because as I said earlier, it's not only what's official that matters, it's how you're perceived. And if you are represented abroad by private institutions, non-governmental institutions that try and showcase your culture, that will appeal to some. Look, as I said, an Indian restaurant can appeal to people, an Indian movie can appeal to people. So sure, why not the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan as well? But to the best of my knowledge, they get no government help or money for what they're doing abroad. Let me add, if I may, one point to my answer to Uday, because I should have said one more thing when I talked about the way in which all of you, Disney and others in the private sector, can push ideas and push change. One thing that I believe you guys also ought to hammer away at in your interactions with government and bureaucracy is the extraordinary contribution you make to job creation. Because you, every time you're producing something, you're employing people, you're physically working crew, the media itself, ancillary industries, you're supporting everything from restaurants and tea boys, chaiwalas on your sets, to distributors, to ticket sellers, popcorn sellers, you name it. There's a huge amount of job generation, including for people who are unskilled and semi-skilled at all levels of the wage profile. And I think what's very important here is to have more of an interface between media as an industry and economic policy makers, as well as those like me who are encouraging creativity. Because I think the whole argument about your contribution to the creative economy of India lies in the argument that you're not just creative, you're also a major economic player. You are, in that sense, as valuable as a more conventional industry. And I think we should keep absolutely pushing this in your interactions with the government. I certainly will take this line in my own discussions. But remember, not only am I chairing a committee in Parliament, I am an opposition MP. And that brings with it certain evident constraints in the present political atmosphere. You guys can speak for yourselves just as well, and I'm sure you will.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. I'm conscious of the time. You're 5 minutes over, but there's another question which has come in chat. And of course, referring to your history as a high-ranking international civil servant, you're an author, and a minister with two different portfolios, in your current role of, or your previous role of chairing the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. But the question I would really like to know, what would be your suggestion for 3 ideas to catalyze foreign policy to create the spark in India's soft power diplomacy?
Well, I mean, we've got given some ideas in the report. Certainly, there is the issue of resources. I mean, if you really want to use diplomacy, foreign policy, government policy in order to promote some of your cultural assets, then you have to put money behind it. And the government of India doesn't, frankly. It's taken them an age. I think a decision, for example, to open a cultural center in Washington took about a dozen years to be implemented. The same in Paris. Very often, I once said in in Parliament that the biggest challenge for Indian foreign policy is not the government of Pakistan; it's our own Ministry of Finance, and I'm afraid that applies to all aspects of foreign policy, including this one. The resources and the shortage thereof are a very crucial factor. A second thing I think is a political large-heartedness and openness of mind that would permit us to showcase diversity. Right now, there's too much of a desire to actually focus only on the official view, the approved view, and that never really sells very well. You know, sanskari culture and sarkari culture are really not the same thing. And I would argue that what the Sarkar wants to put out about Bharatiya Sanskriti is very often not what appeals to others. I mean, I remember Octavio Paz's wonderful essay about India in his book, his last book, In Light of India, in Light of India, it was called. And I mean, a lot of it was devoted to Sanskrit erotic poetry. Now, I'm sorry to say you'll never get a government bureaucrat promoting Sanskrit erotic poetry, right? But the fact is that this is part of our culture. This is also who we are. And this has an extraordinary appeal to certain poets, intellectuals, writers, and thinkers in foreign countries. So my advice to the government would be, if you want cultural diplomacy to succeed, open up your mind and heart to be able to project all of India and not just what you think you consider safe and approved to project. And my third point is that I think we should actually encourage the private sector to do far more in this. I've always been a bit of a skeptic about the impact of governments on foreign publics because, as I say, you know, you can do a festival of India, you can have even a Bollywood film festival, you can do occasional things where the government puts in its official framework and its official imprimatur on advocating our culture and our soft power. But what works best is what comes out normally. If people are inclined to watch an Indian show, it won't be because the government is putting it out there. They'll want to watch it because it's a #1 show in India, that Indians are enjoying watching it. Or it's done well, as I gave the other example, it's done well in Afghanistan. So maybe a neighboring country of Afghanistan might want to watch it. You know, this kind of thinking has to be there. And therefore, allowing the market to help dictate some of where we put our soft power behind would also, I think, be a sensible approach. I'm not promising that any of this is possible. It's my view. I am not the Minister for Culture, and I don't belong to the ruling party, which I would admit has come across as having a far more narrow-minded and straightened view of some of these issues. But the question was asked to me. I've responded with my strong personal view in favor of more diversity, less government dominance, more private sector involvement, and more market forces in this business. Thank you all very much. It's been a good discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. And before I hand over to Dr. Suri to just propose a word of thanks to you, you know, I just saw in the attendees list we have Professor Rajiv Gowda also attending. He's been a strong supporter of the FICCI Forum of Parliamentarians, and you know, I know that both of you know each other very well. We've attended meetings together. But just want to recognize and thank him for being present. And over to you, Dr. Suri, please. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to step in for Harsh. Unfortunately, it's pouring in Calcutta and he's been logged off. So I, with great pleasure, step into his shoes As I said, Shashi Tharoor is multifaceted and brilliantly gifted. He stole the show as always. He was eloquent and he was articulate and he carried the entire soft power to another level. Uh, Dr. Tharoor, we really appreciate your being with us. It's been a complete pleasure. Uday, uh, your interaction with Dr. Tharoor was extremely, extremely rewarding, and I'm sure members of your community and media and entertainment picked up some very, very important and interesting thoughts on that. Dilip, as always, you and Team FICCI have done a wonderful job to put this all together. And last but not the least, all of you who logged in and actually have gone through this entire webinar, I thank you all for being with us today. Stay safe, stay healthy. Namaskar to all of you.
Namaskar.
Thank you all
Thank you,
very much.
Dr. Tharoor.
Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure.
I think Shushma, Manish, and the team entirely well done. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Tharoor.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilip. It went off very well.
Thank you. Thank